The sun was setting over the North Carolina highway as Staff Surgeon James Miller guided his dusty blue Ford pickup into Wilson's gas station. The small station sat alone on the outskirts of Fort Bragg, its neon sign flickering weakly in the growing darkness. After 15 months in Afghanistan, even this simple sight of a regular American gas station felt strange to James. He pulled up to pump number 3, the gravel crunching under his tires. His military fatigues were still crisp and clean. Yeah, he hadn't even taken the time to change after landings. All he could think about was getting home to surprise his wife Sarah and their 6-year-old daughter Emma. They weren't expecting him for another week, but had managed to catch an early transport home. The evening air was warm and humid, typical for North Carolina in late summer. James stepped out of his truck, his combat boots hitting the ground with a familiar thud. He stretched his tall, lean frame, working out the stiffness from the long drive from the airport. At 32, James looked younger than his age, except for his eyes. Those eyes had seen too much during his 3 tours of duty. Inside his wallet, James smiled at the crayon drawing Emma had sent him 2 months ago. He kept it perfectly folded, protected from the harsh Afghan environment. It showed their family 3 stick figures with big smiles standing in front of their house. "Come home soon, Daddy," she written in wobbly letters. Well, baby girl, he thought, Daddy's finally coming home. The gas station was quiet, with only one other car parked near the convenience store. Entrance through the store's windows, James could see an older clerk, reading a newspaper behind the counter. The scene was so peaceful, so normal. It was almost unreal after so many months in a combat zone. As James inserted his credit card into the pump, his military training kept him aware of his surroundings, cataloging what was happening, and he couldn't shake it off, even here at home. He registered the security camera above the store entrance, the blind spots behind the ice machine, the clear sight lines to the highway. These automatic assessments had saved his life overseas. But here they were just echoes of another world. He started filling his tank, watching the numbers climb on the digital display. His mind wandered to the surprise he had planned. Sarah would probably cry. She always did during their reunions. Emma would definitely jump into his arms. She was at that perfect age where Dad was still her hero. He missed her last birthday, but the bear in his duffel bag, wearing a miniature army uniform, would hopefully make up for it. The evening breeze carried the scent of pine trees and nearby barbecue, so different than the dusty air he had breathed for the last 15 months. A few crickets had started their nightly chorus in the tall grass behind the station. Everything felt so wonderfully ordinary, it's somehow special at the same time. James checked his watch. PM. If he drove straight through, he could be home by. Sarah usually put Emma to bed at about, but he knew his little girl often convinced her mom to read just one more story. They'd probably still be up when he got there. The gas pump clicked off and James replaced the nozzle. You need to grab some water for the rest of the drive. Maybe some coffee too. The excitement of coming home early had kept him going so far, but he could feel fatigue creeping in after the long flight and drive. As he screwed the gas cap back on, James heard the distant rumble of motorcycles. The sound grew louder, echoing off the trees surrounding the station. Something about the aggressive rev of the engines made his combat-trained senses tingle with awareness. He learned long ago to trust these instincts. 3 motorcycles onto the highway, their headlights slicing through the gathering gloom. They turned into the station, engines roaring in the still evening air. The bikes were big cruisers, adorned with chrome and custom paint jobs. The riders were big men, wearing leather vests festooned with patches. James stands tall, his face expressionless yet watchful, as bikers loop around to the opposite side of the pump station. You can sense their eyes on him, weighing him in his military uniform. He's encountered enough hostile situations to recognize that the peaceful evening was about to change. Little did these bikers know they were about to mess with the wrong soldier. The 3 motorcycles circled the gas station like sharks, their engines growling in the evening air. They finally parked their bikes side by side, taking up more space than needed near the store entrance. James watched them through his peripheral vision while keeping his relaxed exterior and his mind sized up each rider. The leader was the easiest to pick out, a huge man standing over 6 feet tall with a scraggly gray beard and arms full of faded tattoos. His leather vest displayed a patch that read Road Devils NC along with several other badges that marked him as the group's president. The other 2 riders were smaller but still intimidating, one with a shaved head and the other wearing a bandana. As they dismounted their bikes, their boots crunched on the gravel, and their leather gear creaked. They were talking loudly and laughing, shooting obvious glances in James' direction. The soldier continued about his business, wiping his hands with a paper towel after finishing with the gas pump. Head seen their type before, bullies looking for trouble. Well, what do we have here? The leader called out, his voice deliberately loud. Looks like one of Uncle Sam's toy soldiers decided to grace with his presence. His companions snickered, on cue, background actors in a bad movie. James turned slightly, acknowledging them with a brief nod but nothing more. He learned in Afghanistan that sometimes the best defense was to deny potential enemies the engagement they sought. But the bikers weren't done yet. Who his friends called Bear started walking toward James. His path was intentionally indirect, a predator's approach. "Hey boys there," announced. "Maybe we should thank him for his service." The sarcasm in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. As Bear got closer, James could smell the mixture of cigarettes and cheap beer on his breath. The biker was trying to use his size to intimidate, standing unnecessarily close. James remained still, his combat-trained muscles ready but relaxed, like a coiled spring, waiting to be released. "You know what I think about the military," Bear growled, now standing directly in James' personal space. "I think you guys just play dress up and waste our tax dollars." He deliberately bumped his shoulder into James as he passed, heading toward the store entrance. The other two bikers followed their leader example, each making sure to bump into James as they passed. The one with the bandana spat on the ground near James' boots, while the bald one muttered something about government puppets through it all. James remained statue still, his face betrayed no feeling, but his brain registered everything. The way Bear favored his right leg, slightly an old injury, the way the bald one kept his left hand near his belt, concealing a weapon maybe, the nervous energy rolling off the one with the bandana that made him the most unpredictable. Inside the store, the elderly clerk watched the scene unfold with growing trepidation. Had seen trouble start this way before, and his hand inched toward the phone behind the counter. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Bear and his friends stepped inside the store. The bell above the door chimed in innocently. James knew he needed water and coffee for his drive home, which meant he'd have to go into the store too. He took a slow, deep breath, the same way he used to before leading his unit on patrol. The peaceful evening had been enjoying had evaporated, replaced by a familiar tension he knew all too well. As he walked toward the store entrance, James thought about his wife and daughter waiting at home. He didn't want trouble, had seen enough violence to last a lifetime, but 15 months in a war zone had taught him that sometimes trouble finds you whether you want it or not. The bell chimed again as James pushed open the door, stepping into what was quickly becoming a powder cake of a situation. The convenience store's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as James stepped inside. The cool air from the AC hit his face, a sharp contrast to the humid evening outside behind the counter. The elderly clerk, his name tag grinning Frank, watched the scene with worried eyes. Had been running this store for 30 years and smelled trouble brewing from a mile away. Bear and his two friends were spreading out through the small store, knocking items off shelves accidentally as they moved. The bald one, who the others called Spike, was standing near the coffee machine, deliberately blocking access to it. The guy with the bandana, nicknamed Snake, was opening and closing the cooler doors with unnecessary force. James moved calmly to the water section, keeping his awareness sharp. 15 months in Afghanistan had taught him to track multiple threats while appearing casual. He could sense Bear watching him through Chip BS mirror, waiting for any sign of fear or aggression. "Hey soldier boy," Bear called out, his voice echoing in the small store. "You think you're some kind of hero?" He picked up a bag of chips, crushed it in his massive hand, and dropped it back on the shelf. "My cousin joined the army, came back in a box. What do you think about that?" James selected his water bottle, keeping his movements smooth and controlled. He knew Bear was trying to provoke him, looking for any excuse to start something. The soldier had seen this tactic before. Create the scenario, instigate a reaction, then go into self-defense. Can't even answer a simple question. Snake joined in, slamming another cooler door. "Maybe they don't teach manners in the army anymore." He laughed, a high-pitched sound not quite befitting the tough guy persona Frank the clerk had served in Vietnam. He did know the look in James' eyes, the calm focus of one who'd seen actual combat, the kind that didn't involve beer bottles and brawl fights. His hand lay across the phone, ready to dial the cops in case the situation got any worse. James headed toward the coffee station, but Spike didn't budge. "Excuse me," James said softly, his first words since entering the store. His voice was solid, professional, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. "What's that?" Spike mimicked, cupping his ear. "Did the toy soldier say something?" He faked pouring himself coffee, spilling it on purpose on the floor. "Oops, looks like There's been a spill, better call in the military to clean it up. Bear walked forward, his heavy boots leaving dirty prints on the clean floor. He stood next to Spike, forming a wall of leather and attitude between James and the coffee machine. You know what I think, he growled, getting close enough that James could count the gray hairs in his beard. I think you military types think you're better than everybody else, walking around in your fancy uniform forms, expecting people to bow down and thank you. James didn't say anything, just stared forward. But his muscles were coiled and ready. Had spent years training for close-quarter combat, learning how to take down multiple opponents in a tight space, but he also knew that the best fight was the one you might have avoided. Snake showed up behind James, finishing their triangle of terror. Perhaps we should instruct him on some respect, he said, flexing his fist to hear the knuckles pop. The noise reverberated off the walls of the store like a string of firecrackers. Frank observed the scene escalate. He had witnessed enough barroom brawls and street fights to understand this was becoming a breaking point. The old veteran's fingers danced over the keypad on the phone, preparing to call for an intervention. That's when Bay made his fatal mistake, reaching out with his enormous hand. He grasped the American flag patch on James' uniform shoulder. What's this worth to you, soldier boy, he sneered, starting to pull at it. Let's see how tough you really are. The air in the store seemed to freeze. James' eyes shifted slowly from the coffee machine to Bear's face. Something changed in those eyes, switch being flipped from passive observer to trained warrior. The three bikers had just crossed the line they couldn't uncross. Time seemed to slow down in the fluorescent-lit store as Bear's fingers gripped James' flag patch. Frank, the elderly clerk, saw something change in the solder's posture, a subtle shift that his old Vietnam veteran's instincts recognized immediately. It was like watching a lion wake up after pretending to sleep. You know what else I hate about you military types? Bear continued, oblivious to the danger he was in. He gave the patch another tug, threads starting to snap. You come back here thinking you're some kind of heroes. What's so heroic about dropping bombs from the sky, huh? James stood perfectly still, his mind flashing back to the brothers he lost overseas. He thought about Private Jenkins, who stepped on an IED while protecting a school, about Sergeant Ree, who'd taken a bullet while carrying a wounded civilian child to safety, but Captain Thompson, who sacrificed himself to save his entire human. Snake moved closer, encouraged by James' continued silence. Maybe he's scared, he taunted, reaching out to poke James in the back. Not so tough without your whole army behind you, are you? Spike laughed, a harsh sound that bounced off the store's windows. Hey Bear, maybe we should take his uniform as a souvenir. That'd make a nice Halloween costume. He reached for James' sleeve, his fingers dirty and greasy. That's when Bear made his final mistake. He spat on the floor right next to James' polished boots and said the words that sealed his fate. Your dead military buddies probably better off that way. At least they don't have to pretend to be heroes anymore. The fluorescent lights seemed to flicker as James finally moved his head, slowly turning to look Bear directly in the eyes. Frank watched the soldier's face change, not with anger or fear, but with a cold, professional focus that made the old veteran's spine tingle. I've seen guys like you before. James spoke, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the store. In every country I've served in, there are always bullies who mistake kindness for weakness. His words were calm, measured, like he was giving a report. Bear blinked, suddenly uncertain. Something in James' tone made him loosen his grip on the flag patch for the first time. The biker leader noticed the combat ribbons on James' chest, the Special Forces badge, the Ranger tab. Eyes widened as he realized he may have underestimated the situation. You better watch your mouth, soldier boy. Snake threatened, but his voice cracked slightly. He could feel the air change with the weight of what was about to happen. James slowly reached up and removed Bear's hand from his uniform, his grip firm, controlled, and considerably stronger than what the biker had anticipated. I'm going to give you one chance, James said softly. Walk away now, get on your bikes and leave. Spike, trying to save their macho image, stepped forward aggressively. Or what? There's three of us and one of you. What do you think you're going to do? James didn't say a word at first. Instead, he locked eyes with each biker and turned his gaze steady and cold as it had been clearing buildings in Kandahar. It was the stare of a man who had seen genuine terror and wasn't impressed by any playground bully. Last chance, James said flatly. Walk away. There, his pride stung. He made the choice that would keep him up for months afterward. He cocked back his huge fist, the muscles bunching. Beneath his leather vest, "Get him," he snarled at his friends. Frank made a move towards the phone, but he knew it would be too late for the police to stop what was going to happen. The old veteran said a silent prayer, not for the soldier but for the three bikers who had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Bear's fist sliced through the air where James' head had been a split second earlier. The soldier had moved with a quickness that caught all the people in the store off guard, stepping inside. Bear's reaching off, balancing him before the biker could regain his balance. James had already shifted from combat stance, feet planted, hands ready, eyes alert to what they Bear started to say. But his words were cut short as James executed a perfect arm lock maneuver. The same move he used countless times during close quarters combat training now sent the massive biker stumbling forward, his own momentum working against him. Snake and Spike rushed in from different directions, thinking their numbers would overwhelm the soldier. After all, they had never met anyone with special forces training, one who had spent years learning how to handle various enemies in close proximity. Their street fighting skills were about to meet military precision. James flowed through the attackers like water. Sidestepping Snake's wild swing, he turned the biker's momentum against him and sent him crashing into a chip display. In that same smooth motion, an elbow block sent Spike's attempt to grab him over the top. The ball biker's forward motion became a lever to throw them off balance. Frank watched awestruck from behind the counter. He had seen trained soldiers in his day, but this was something else. James was not fighting angry or violent, but methodically in control, like a chess master who always thinks 3 moves ahead. Bear recovered and charged once more, roaring like his namesake. James met the charge with a perfectly executed combat technique. He sidestepped slightly, used Bear's momentum against him, and applied leverage to just the right amount of pressure to the biker's elbow and shoulder. The huge man was down on his stomach before he knew what happened. Snake scrambled up from the fallen chip rack, potato chips crunching under his boots. He pulled out a small knife from his belt, its blade glinting under the fluorescent lights. "You're dead now, soldier boy," he snarled, slashing wildly. James' response was immediate and decisive. Years of combat training took over as he deflected the knife hand, trapped it, and applied pressure to Snake's wrist. The knife clattered to the floor as Snake howled in pain. His arm locked in a hold that could break it with just a little more pressure. Spike tried to attack from behind, but James had been tracking his movement through the reflection in the store window. The soldier dropped his center of gravity, used Snake's trapped arm as leverage, and sent both bikers tumbling over each other like bowling pins. Bear was getting up again, his face red with rage and embarrassment. James released Snake and turned to face the biker leader. "Stay down," he advised calmly. "You don't want this to continue." But Bear was beyond listening. He charged forward, throwing a haymaker punch that would have knocked out a normal man. James slipped the punch like a professional boxer, stepped inside Bear's guard, and executed a perfect hip throw. The big biker went airborne for a brief moment before crashing hard onto his back, the impact forcing all the air from his lungs. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. 3 big tough bikers lay on the floor groaning and dazed while James stood calmly in the center of the store. Not a single item on the shelves had been broken except for the chip rack. Snake had fallen into. Frank noticed that James hadn't thrown a single punch. Every move had been defensive, designed to neutralize rather than harm. This wasn't street violence, this was military efficiency at its finest. "The police are on their way," Frank announced, his hand still on the phone. He could hear sirens in the distance growing louder. James straightened his uniform and looked at the 3 fallen bikers. "Next time," he said quietly, "think twice before you disrespect the flag or the soldiers who die defending it." Red and blue lights flashed through the store windows as 2 police cars pulled into the gas station, the evening air filled with the crunch of tires on gravel and the brief wail of a siren. Frank had already pulled up the security camera footage on the store's ancient computer system while James stood calmly near the coffee machine, finally pouring himself that much-needed cup. Officer Sarah Martinez, a veteran cop with 15 years on the force, was the first through the door. She took in the scene with experienced eyes. 3 large bikers sprawled on the floor, a scattered chip display, and a soldier. "Ly adding cream to his coffee." "Evening, ma'am," James said politely, his military bearing evident in his posture. "I'm sorry to make the scene." Bear was still sitting up. His pride hurt more than his body. Snake and Spike were still trying to untangle themselves from each other, their leather jackets creaking with every movement. The knife Snake had pulled lay harmlessly on the floor, now marked as evidence. Frank called it in. Officer Martinez said, addressing James, said something about 3 bikers causing trouble with a soldier. Her partner, Officer Thompson, was already checking on the fallen bikers, making sure none of them needed immediate medical attention. "That's right," James replied. "These gentlemen took issue with my uniform. When words failed to resolve the situation, I was forced to defend myself. He spoke like he was giving a mission report, clear and concise. Frank shuffled over to Officer Martinez, the security foot playing on his phone. Got it all right here, he said proudly. These boys started it. The soldier, he gave them every chance to walk away. The officers watched the footage, their eyebrows rising as they saw just how efficiently James had handled the situation. Special Forces Officer Martinez asked, noticing the patches on James' uniform. Yes, ma'am, Staff Surgeon James Miller. Just returned from Afghanistan. Bear struggled to his feet, his massive frame swaying slightly. We want to press charges, he demanded, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. He attacked us. Officer Thompson looked up from his notepad. Sir, the footage clearly shows you throw the first punch, and he added, picking up Snake's knife. Bringing a weapon into the situation makes this a whole different ball game. Snake's face went pale. He had a record, and bring a knife to a fight would definitely violate his parole. Spike just sat on the floor staring at his boots, all his earlier bravado gone. Hey Race, what's going to happen? Officer Martinez announced, her voice carrying the weight of authority. We're taking statements from everyone, but based on the footage and witness testimony, this was clearly self-defense. She turned to the bikers. You three, however, are coming down to the station. As the officers began reading writs and taking statements, Frank approached James with a fresh cup of coffee. This one's on the house, son. He said, his voice rough with emotion. Reminds me of something that happened in '69 outside Saigon. James listened respectfully as Frank shared a brief war story, recognizing the bond that connected soldiers across generations. The old veteran's eyes grew misty as he talked about his own homecoming, so different from today's world. Outside, more patrol cars had arrived. The officers were running the biker IDs, discovering outstanding warrants for Bear, and a parole violation for Snake. Their tough guy act had crumbled in the face of real consequences. Officer Martinez approached James one last time. You handled that situation perfectly, Sergeant, she said admiringly. Minimal force, no serious injuries, clear self-defense. You're free to go. Welcome home. By the way, James Thaner gathered his coffee and water and prepared to leave as he walked past the bikers now in handcuffs. Bear couldn't meet his eyes. The massive biker had learned a hard lesson about judging people by their appearance rather than their capabilities. Frank watched for miscounter as James headed for the door. Hey, Sergeant, he called out, next time you're passing through, the coffee's always free for you. The police station buzzed with activity as Bear, Snake, and Spike sat in separate interview rooms, their tough guy fads completely shattered. Detective Roberts, a 20-year veteran of the force, reviewed their records on his computer screen while shaking his head in disbelief. So you're telling me, he said to Bear, whose real name turned out to be Stanley Thompson, that you thought it was a good idea to pick a fight with a Special Forces soldier? A detestably amused and disappointed voice. Bear slumped in his chair, his massive shoulders drooping. His leather vest had been taken into evidence, leaving him in a faded Led Zeppelin t-shirt which made him look surprisingly ordinary. We didn't know he was Special Forces, he mumbled. Next room over, Snake was dealing with his parole officer, Mrs. Jenkins, a stern-faced woman who'd seen it all. A knife, she said, her voice sharp with disapproval. You brought a knife to a fist fight at a gas station. Do you understand what this means for your parole? Meanwhile, back at Wilson's gas station, the evening had settled back into its routine pace. Frank was busy reconstructing the display of chips, but he kept setting it down to replay the security footage on his phone. Every time he showed it to a customer, his voice swelled with pride, like he'd been part of the action himself. See that move right there? He'd say, pointing at the screen. That's what they taught us in Vietnam. Well, not that smooth, but similar. The customers would gather around watching in amazement as James efficiently neutralized 3 attackers without throwing a single punch. Local news vans had started arriving at the station. The story of a Special Forces soldier defending himself against 3 bikers was too good to pass up. Reporter Lisa Chun from Channel 7 interviewed Frank, who gave a colorful play-by-play of the events. It was like watching a dance, Frank told the camera, gesturing enthusiastically. These 3 big guys thought they had him cornered, but that soldier, he moved like water. Reminded me of my buddy Martinez back in '69, back at the police station. Officer Martinez was finishing up her report. The charges were piling up: attempted assault, carrying a concealed weapon, heroin violation, and several outstanding warrants that the incident had brought to light. She couldn't help but smile how a simple act of bullying led to their downfall. In the station's break room, officers gathered around a laptop to watch the gas station security. Footage that had already started circulating among law enforcement groups. That's how you handle multiple attackers, the department's self-defense instructor commented, admiring an perfect textbook technique. Snake's knife had been logged into evidence along with statements from all parties involved. The weapon would add another 6 months to his sentence minimum. Spike, whose real name was Timothy Parker, called his wife to bail them out. Her angry voice could be heard through the phone across the room. Social media was already buzzing with by the time he said the story. Somebody had grabbed a partial incident from the gas station's parking lot with their phone, and the video was going viral. Comments poured in from veterans and civilians alike in praise of the solder's restraint and skill. Frank hadn't had a break in calls since old military buddies called after recognizing his gas station on the news, and they swapped stories about their own experiences. This elderly veteran was starting to feel younger with every retelling, as he spoke proudly of how he knew trouble was coming when those bikers rolled in. As the night shift took over at the police station, Detective Roberts gathered the final statements. The 3 bikers would face a judge in the morning. Their reputations in the local biker community would forever be tarnished. Their road devils and capatches didn't seem so intimidating now, stuffed in evidence bags. Officer Martinez pinned the last photos to her case board. 3 mugshots showing faces that were more embarrassed than injured. Next to them she placed the gas station security camera shots. A perfect sequence showing how training and discipline had won out over brute force and strong-arm tactics, as James Miller finally pulled into his driveway at p.m. The porch light was still on, and through the window you could see his wife Sarah reading a book on the couch. The events at the gas station had delayed his surprise homecoming by almost an hour, but looking at his home now, none of that seemed to matter. Meanwhile, across town, the story of what happened at Wilson's gas station spread like wildfire through the local veteran community. At the FW Post, 2,876 veterans gathered around phones and tablets watching the viral video of the incident. Old-timers nodded their heads in approval, knowing such a disciplined response was only possible through many years of professional military training. That is the difference between real training and bar fights, said retired Master Surgeon Wilson, pointing at the screen. No shouting, no macho nonsense. Pure efficiency. The other veterans murmured in assent. Many had similarly faced situations in other circumstances during their own transitions back to civilian life at the county jail. Snake and Spike each sat in a different holding cell, lost to their own thoughts. Bear stared at his hands at how they had intimidated so many people before but proved completely useless against real combat training. The tough guy image had built over years had been dismantled in seconds by a soldier who hadn't even thrown a punch. Frank closed the gas station down for the night, but not before taping a new sign behind the counter. Veterans always welcome free coffee. He tidied the security footage onto a personal USB drive. Knowing it would become a regular feature at his weekly veterans breakfast meetings, the local newspaper was already preparing their morning headline: Special Forces soldier shows restraint in gas station confrontation. Its article would focus not on the fight itself but on how military training emphasized control and de-escalation over violence. Back at Jameis' house, as he walked up the pathway, the front door suddenly flew open. 6-year-old Emma, who was supposed to be in bed, came running out in her pajamas. "Daddy!" Why, she screamed, launching herself into his arms. Sarah appeared in the doorway, tears already streaming down her face, as James hugged his daughter and kissed his wife. The events at the gas station felt like a distant memory. Emma touched the flag patch on his uniform, the same patch Bear had tried to disrespect, and said proudly, "My daddy's a soldier." The next morning at Fort Bragg, Jameis' commander officer received multiple emails praising his soldiers' conduct. The security footage had made its way through military channels, and instructors were already planning to use it as a training example of proper threat management and minimum force response. The Road Devils NC Club held an emergency meeting to discuss the incident. By unanimous vote, they expelled Bear, Snake, and Spike from their ranks. The president made it crystal clear that disrespecting veterans would never be tolerated, and that the 3 have brought shame to their organization. A week later, Frank hosted his regular veterans breakfast at the gas station. The small store was packed with former service members from various eras: Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, 31.42 Afghanistan, where they shared stories, having free coffee, and discussing how military training had shaped their lives after service. Officer Martinez stopped by during her morning patrol. She added the gas station's security footage to the police academy's training materials, using it to show how proper training and self-control could diffuse dangerous situations without excessive force. As for the three bikers, the court date approached with a heavy weight of consequences as their actions did not only earn them legal troubles but had taught them, too, a valuable lesson on the judgment of others by facing the longest sentence because of his outstanding warrants. He wrote an apology letter to be delivered to the base, saying he was sorry to have disrespected the uniform and everyone that wears it. This story became a local legend to be told in barbershops, diners, and veterans meetings. It wasn't about fighting or revenge, but discipline, training, and silent strength that a true warrior carries. It simply reminded you that true heroes don't go in search of fights, but they sure know how to bring them to a close.